And welcome to the Conduit. We're delighted to have you tonight for an important discussion on the future of the Middle East. At a time when thousands are returning home to devastation in Gaza, the political dynamics of the region still remain uncertain. While Iran continues to exert its influence, newly enlightened grassroots movements are threatening to challenge the current establishments and reshape the region's future. If you're a member of the Conduit, thank you for joining us. And if you are new and you'd like to learn more, please chat to a member of the team or visit our website for more details. Before we hand over to our incredible panel tonight, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this evening, Negin Shiragai. Negin is the founder of Azadi Network and a former BBC Persian news anchor. Negin has been at the forefront of promoting the women, life and freedom movement in the diaspora, and she has spoken at the Human Rights Council and the UK Parliament. She highlights corruption and human rights abuses on her podcast, Kutena.
Thank you so much, Asha. Lovely to see your faces here, and thank you so much for being here. And for us, like as Iranians, I'm going to put it out there that we love to see people paying attention to Iran and showing up for our events. So thank you. I think when the idea of this panel came to us, we were talking about at the time that the Middle East, the war in Gaza was going on. We didn't know what's happening. There was a narrative out there that the Iranian proxies in Middle East are going to be targeted massively, and that's going to change the shape of the Middle East and how much power Iran has in the region. And then suddenly, overnight, we heard the news that Syria, Bashar Assad is gone, and Syria has a new government. So it was really interesting to see that I would get a lot of calls and texts from my Iranian friends and saying, oh my God, we have to think about the future of Iran. What's going to happen? The Middle East is changing completely, and there is another new energy coming back to the Iranian society thinking about, oh, we have to plan for the future. Dictators can go overnight, and where are we standing right now? It doesn't look like we have a plan. So people have started to talking about it. And I think this is something we are hoping is going to contribute to that idea and bringing new ideas to it and examining it from different point of view. And hopefully, as I promised you guys, we're not going to give a plan for the future, but we will look at the trends and come up with possible outcomes of the events of the last 2 years. So I'm going to leave it to you. As we said, it's going to be a relaxed conversation. Hopefully, we will give enough context to the ideas that are on the table that people from different backgrounds would understand it into the same level, and people with more expertise in the region that are sitting in the audience would take away some stuff from you guys, and I'm sure that would happen. So I'll start with you, Ali. I'm not going to ruin the introduction. I'll leave it to you to do it.
Oh, so, do you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah, introduce yourself.
For those, I'm Ali Ansari. I teach the history of Iran at the University of St Andrews, among other things. I write for this and that and the other, occasionally newspapers and other things, and occasionally online. But mainly, I'm a historian of modern Iran. So I teach the history of modern Iran from my perspective, is from 1800. So it's a good 200 years of looking at the way in which the state has developed. But that's me.
Hi, I'm Andreas Krieg. I'm from King's College London, the Defence Studies Department. We work for the MOD at the Global Strategy Programme. I'm the CEO of MENA Analytica. It's a political risk firm here in London that covers everything from Morocco to Iran, with a great focus on the Arab side of the Gulf. And I'm also a fellow at the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies.
Lovely, and I think I'm going to start with you, Andreas. Let's get into the bits and bolts of what happened in the last 2 years, especially in the countries you've been following. I'm going to leave Iran to Ali and then come back to you.
Right. So obviously lots of people have been looking at the Middle East since the 7th of October, but I would even have to go further back. I think what we've seen is over the last 20 years is a gradual withdrawal of the United States. We end up with a region, as I define it, as a network-centric region where you have networks of non-state actors and state actors all collaborating with one another. And so what you end up with is a network of different actors of interdependencies and interconnections, which are commercial, violent non-state actors, you've got some state institutions involved in that, you've got a lot of very influential and powerful individuals involved in that. And so it's quite a messy, sort of messy-looking regional outlook.
Sorry, Andreas, we're going to swap your microphone because it keeps dropping.
Do you have to start again?
Okay.
Yeah, I think the battery is going down, not your fault.
No, so do I have to start again? Okay, now, so if you have a network-centric region in the Middle East, you have a Middle East that is defined by micro events and micro activities by state and non-state actors. And state actors are ever less important in this kind of messy environment. So most people look at failed states and failing states. I'd say the region is more than just failed and failing states, because even when a state has failed, we're not confronted with an absence of governance. We actually see quite a lot of non-state actors picking up the pieces, and there is some form of governance. What we have seen since the Arab Spring in particular, after the Americans have left, is that most of the old regimes have collapsed, and outside of the Arab Gulf states, there's pretty much no solid statehood left anywhere in the Middle East. And for most of it, I mean, loads of analysts have always looked at Iran as somewhat the entity that would somewhat keep the peace and exploit this insecurity across the region. Since the 7th of October, what we've seen, though, is one particular network, which I think is probably still the most powerful network in the region, which is the so-called axis of resistance, has been really gradually and decisively degraded. But the thing, if you think about networks, which is very different from the hierarchies that we tend to look at the region. I mean, most of the time we look at the region, we look at states, and we look at failing or failed or functioning states. But when you actually look at networks, you have to realize that networks cannot fail. They cannot collapse. A network cannot be destroyed. You can contain it, you can degrade it, but even if you take a node out of the network will still exist, right? It's an extremely resilient form of organization. And so if you look at at what happened since the 7th of October, is the Israelis have been confronted with this task of trying to degrade various networks. Hamas is a network in itself. Hezbollah is a network in itself. The Houthis are a network in itself. When we say network, it's not just a network of militias, but it's a network of all kinds of commercial actors as well, individuals, commodity traders, bankers, financiers. And they're not just contained in the Middle East. They're extending into Western Africa, South America. It's a global network of networks. And the IRGC is a great network. I mean, they have orchestrated quite a powerful network. And despite the fact that a lot of the senior members of the IRGC have been killed, a lot of senior members of Hamas have been killed, a lot of senior members of Hezbollah have been killed, the networks themselves still exist. They've been degraded, but they still exist. So we're now confronted with a region where there are different networked actors. The states have no means of engaging with it. The Israelis are trying to somewhat contain the networks, but also don't have a solution to it, because one powerful thing about networks is they're led and built around strong narratives. And that's true for the axis of resistance. That narrative is the idea of resistance, the narrative of resistance. And what happened since the 7th of October is that narrative of resistance has been emboldened, particularly in the Arab world, maybe less so in Iran, but in the Arab world has been emboldened. And we've seen a level of mobilization across the Arab world, across the Middle East, for the Palestinian cause and against Israel, and thereby also by extension against the West, against the UK, against the United States, that has really reshaped the dynamic in a way that Palestine is now at the heart of pretty much any sort of Arab civil society.
I think, Ali, that network actually went the opposite way inside Iran, or at least it gives that feeling from the narrative that's coming from the civil society or the grassroots.
Yes, I mean, I agree. I agree with Andreas actually on the point about the fact that when central authorities break down, you will get these sort of smaller, more devolved networks emerging, and some of them surviving. I do think actually in the Iranian case that the degradation and the sort of the weakening of its networks and its ability to finance them and to support them will have consequences. I mean, I don't think. Where I would slightly differ, I suppose, is I don't think these networks have a sort of an inevitable survivability about them. And one of the points that I would say is on this basis of narratives. I mean, the point about the narrative is that you're meant to be able to sustain it. And there's meant to be a sort of an internal logic about it. And in the Iranian case, of course, that logic hasn't actually worked as well as it should have. So you start 2024 rather more bombastically in terms of Iran, in terms of its axis of resistance. It seems to be playing the game quite well. Israel is on the back foot. The focus, as I think is quite rightly said, is on Gaza. Netanyahu sort of plays a slightly different game. He switches the focus onto Hezbollah and onto Iran very emphatically. Now, of course, the difference here is while the Palestinian cause will be popular in the Arab world, Hezbollah is not. I mean, this is one of the things that we have to bear in mind. Hezbollah is seen essentially as a Shia and an Iranian proxy. And, of course, in the great geopolitical context in the Middle East, while everyone in the Arab world certainly wants to support the Palestinians, not interestingly enough, and we can talk about this later perhaps, among Iranians, ordinary Iranians, the mood has moved in a slightly different direction. But certainly if there's support for that in the wider Arab world, there hasn't been really the sort of support for basically enhancing or enabling Iran's power in the region. So they've been quite content to see the weakening of Hezbollah. And of course, Syria is a case in point. I mean, that's a major blow to Iran. So in many ways, I'd have to say that the 2024 has been a pivotal year in the sense that Iran started out quite emboldened and I think has ended up much, much more weakened. And it's weakened on two fronts. One is that its networks have been quite severely constrained and curtailed. I think its narrative is hitting a bit of a roadblock. I mean, it's not working quite as well as it suggested. But here, I think most importantly is its domestic support is flagging very, very badly. And so it's not able to project the sort of power that it would like because it can't rely on domestic support for what it wants to do. So I think these things are, make for a much more volatile, interesting in the Chinese sense of the term, Middle East. And one which I think in 2025, there are going to be some interesting repercussions. And certainly with the change, the collapse of the Assad regime, there's no doubt, as the Iranians, I mean, actually the Revolutionary Guards themselves have admitted, because everything leaks in Iran, by the way, if you know where to look for it. It's, they've sort of publicly said that the loss of Syria has been a strategic blow for the regime. And I should say here, by the way, one of the things that hopefully will come out as we continue to discuss this is we have to make a very, very clear distinction between the regime, the Islamic Republic, and Iran and the wider civil society and the people. Because I think there's an absolute gulf of opinion between the two. I mean, in this point, I must admit, I have to agree with Marco Rubio during his confirmation hearings, that there is a very, very clear distinction between the people of Iran and those who seek to govern it.
For me, there is still this question that Syria, I agree with you, that the network doesn't have a head. It's quite resilient in some ways, but also it can lean one way or another, and it doesn't have loyalty to the hierarchy. So what do you see in terms of what's happening in Syria and how it would affect? Would Iran still have those networks inside Syria who would be able to destabilize Syria and not allowing the Ahmad Shara to be able to stabilize a government? Or what's the future for Syria in your view?
No, what we have to say about networks is networks are like organisms. There are hubs in there, but nobody controls the network. Iran never controlled the network, and we see that with the Houthis, we see that with the various proxies that the Iranians are using. In the end of the day, they've been very much embedded in local society as well. Even if Hezbollah is extremely unpopular in Lebanon right now and elsewhere, they still have a very strong support base, which is also true for Hamas in Palestine, which is true for the Houthis in Yemen, although they're really struggling. But despite the fact Iran has set the network up to govern and govern itself, the problem with Syria is it was a key node, a key hub. Let's not call it a node. It was a hub in terms of the logistics of it, and particularly to resupply Hezbollah. Losing access to the airport in Damascus in particular, is something that the regime in Iran will not be able to compensate for that quickly. That's absolutely true. They're the biggest losers of what happened in December 2024. Now, al-Shara himself is, again, we have to, HTS itself is a network, right? So, we always think of this as being some sort of hierarchical, terrorist organization, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, Al-Qaeda turning into some, into a new entity. But HTS is a network of at least 15 different groups. And then you have the entire Islamist front in Syria. Again, a very diverse network of different actors as well. Then you break this apart and look into, then you've got the Shia minorities, you've got Christian minorities, you've got you've got the Druze, you've got the Alawites. All of them also have their own sort of local leaders themselves, have their own non-state actors. Some of them armed, some of them non-armed. So what you see is networks within networks. It's a system of networks. Al-Shara is the one who's now leading that as a key hub. He's got substantial, at least authority, but he is struggling, and on the fringes, and that's when you look at networks, you have a core-periphery dynamic. He's at the core of that network, but on the periphery, the network is crumbling, and he's certainly not controlling it. The danger of this is, again, Iran being a network state. I would even say that the Islamic Republic is a network state. It was set up not as a hierarchy, but as a network of different hubs. And I think the Iranians are very good at exploiting networks, not to build anything. They're certainly not building anything in Syria, but in terms of disruption. The great struggle that Al-Shara has now is building consensus. Consolidating power means bringing all these different networked actors, all these different sort of nodes together. The biggest problem that he's facing right now is that the UAE, the Israelis, the Russians, and the Iranians will try to make this project fail because they need it to fail. And the Iranians we've already seen loads of false flags, loads of attempts of subversion where they're saying, oh, look what HTS is doing, look what they're doing to the minorities, they're not allowing Christmas trees, loads of disinformation campaigns, and most of it, if you go to the root of it, being promoted by pro-Iranian or pro-regime, I should say, pro-regime and regime outlets. And so they are trying to disrupt where they can, but that doesn't mean they will come back. I can't see how they come back.
Ali, what's your take on it? Do you think Iran would allow, Shara to be able to stabilize itself?
Well, I mean, I agree with Andreas entirely on the point that I think the IRGC, and certainly for Khamenei. So let's step back. The whole exercise in Syria is an exercise in IRGC, Khamenei sort of expansionism, essentially. I mean, there was a period after the global war on terror, Iraq and Afghanistan, the Taliban and Saddam Hussein knocked out, that Iran sort of laid claim, in a sense, to its near abroad. And you could make a lot of sense out of it. I mean, in terms of a sort of geopolitical and nationalist reality and national interest, you could see that, the Iranians could make claim to the fact that it had interests in Iraq. Of course it did. I mean, it didn't want another threat to emerge from the country and this sort of thing. But to expand into Syria is a different kettle of fish, and it has a sort of an element of the sort of, obviously the deterrence, as they would call it, against Israel and so on and so forth, but principally as a need to, as a means of expanding their networks, and obviously Syria was a hub. And but this was not a move that was popular in the wider Iran, even within the regime, I have to say. So there's a wonderful video of the old ex-president Hashemi Rafsanjani sort of railing against us in 2013, and he puns up and he says, we have no interest at all in getting to bed with Assad, this is a fiasco, what are we doing? And of course, Rafsanjani is dismissed and told to shut up and keep his mouth shut and so on and so forth, and doesn't understand geopolitics and this and that and the other. So for the IRGC, more than the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iran, Syria was a case study. And the loss of Syria is a major blow to them and obviously to Khamenei's credibility. So their natural reaction to that, rather than sort of admit defeat in a sense, is to double down and say we will regroup and we will retake this. So I do agree with that in a sense it is in their interest to make sure that what's happening now doesn't work. But the key question here is, while they're looking at Syria, are they ignoring what's going on underneath their own feet, basically, in the country? I mean, and this is the point. And I think far too much of sort of analysis of Iran is really to see Iran as a sort of an international player, a regional player, to see it as the state in almost a two-dimensional way. What we really need to do is to extend into the third and fourth dimensions, if you will, and look at what's going on within Iran itself. And if you look at what's going on in Iran itself, they are getting weaker. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And the problem with this is not simply international, pushback. It's economic weakness, it's environmental weakness, by the way. We don't do enough on the environment in Iran, but it's a complete fiasco, by the way. And then, of course, there's the political crisis of legitimacy that's going on. These things have been, in many ways, in one form or another, have been going on for many, many years. But the point is, they're all now coming to head almost at once. I mean, they're all collating together, and it's causing a major, major crisis. And I certainly think, as we discussed earlier, after we've had, 3 or 4 major, major demonstrations, protests in Iran over the last 5-6 years. 2017, 2019, 2022. I mean, we can go back to 2009, of course, as the originator of all this. But it's quite clear to me that 2022 has been a watershed moment in the relationship between wider society and the state. Gone are the days when people said this system can reform. It's finished. Forget it. It's not going to happen. People are fed up with it. They want to move on. And, you know, that sort of shift has taken a number of years, obviously, to come to fruition. But it's there. And if you look at the attitudes in Iran today among, you know, ordinary people, it's really quite distant and broken with the official regime ideology. So the idea, for instance, that Iran is going to spend lots of political, moral, economic capital on Syria or Lebanon or fighting Israel is of no interest whatsoever to the vast majority of Iranians. And they cannot get the support they need to do this sort of stuff. And instead, people are saying within the country, we need to be able to heat our homes, we need to be able to keep the lights on, we need to be able to get enough water. And if you can't provide this, you've got a lot of questions to answer.
Andreas, 2022, we talked about IRGC's corrupt network within the region, as well as, you know, the extent of it in Latin America and all of it. How do you see that network working right now in terms of its financial elements? Because for the ones who are following Iran, they know within the last at least 10 years, Iran basically became the military state. It's run by IRGC, its foreign policy is dictated by Quds forces, the economy is run by IRGC. A lot of, you know, this power or like water, a lot of infrastructure is in the hand of former IRGC leaders. So do you see IRGC in terms of its financials and hold inside the country strong enough, because we know it's a corrupt system and it relies on that network to be able to continue its operations?
Well, that's my great concern. So yes, it is a military dictatorship, right, where it's run, I hate that analogy of the deep state, but, you know, we're always talking about the government, and, you know, people pretend that Iran actually has a government, which it does, obviously, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it's when we call about this, it's a religio-military sort of deep state of it, and it's quite good at financing itself, and it is extremely resilient in generating money for itself. Obviously, none of it will be generated in Iran or will be trickling down in Iran. But the network itself, again, being self-sustaining, there are loads of people with vested interest in the network, interdependent. One of the great hubs of this is Dubai. I mean, you know, if Dubai and the UAE, still this is how the UAE buy themselves security vis-a-vis their greatest antagonist to the north, which is Iran, is by allowing these networks to continuously doing business there, smuggling, you know, nowadays, you know, the IRGC is in the crypto business. There are so many different means to translate one value to another, not just smuggling oil, but smuggling currencies, and then in financing and investing that overseas. The only problem is that the bill for, you know, what I call surrogate warfare, which is this network delegating to this different surrogates across the region, the bill for that has increased over the last couple of years. I mean, there are billions and billions, tens of billions that Iran has spent in Syria alone over the last couple of years. These were billions that Iran doesn't have and that even the IRGC doesn't have. So, but the great concern is that the IRGC as a network itself can support itself. But how good is it when 80% or even more inside the country do not support this network? So obviously it becomes more oppressive, it becomes more reactionary, more authoritarian. However, my concern is if there was, and obviously the revolution hasn't stopped, people think like, oh, you know, what we see is the spikes of revolution in Iran become more frequent, right? The outbursts become more frequent. But we've never gone back, if you look at this, you know, we've never gone back through, you know, somewhat of a line of stability where we're saying, oh, now it's stable again. No, it's simmering, right? It just needs, we don't know what it takes for it to completely explode. My concern is that the IRGC are just not going to go and say, okay, fine, the rest of the country is against us. I agree with Ali, obviously can't reform it. And that this kind of network is so well endowed financially, and obviously has global reach, that they will not go and they will keep up a fight, and that it will lead any transition from the regime right now to anything, whatever the future is going to be extremely messy.
This is really interesting. I'm going to tell you a personal story that over the weekend I was staying in a friend's house in Vienna, and her parents called from Iran, and the dad started talking to me and said, you know, they still see me as a TV presenter, so they started talking about politics, and he was really enthusiastically saying, you know, right now, 85% of Iranians, they hate the government. And this is fantastic. And we were laughing and saying, like, only in Iran you can hear that, you know, 85% dissent would be something praised by people. But with all of these elements that we talked about, Ali, why the state is not collapsing.
Well, I mean, you see, the thing is there's two ways of looking at this, and one is to see, is to look at the surface, and that would get you to the conclusion that the state is not collapsing. The other one would be to look at trends, and to try and sort of lift the lid on what's going on. And the thing with, let me put it this way, the West has been actually pretty woeful in terms of predicting political upheaval. Okay, we didn't predict the fall of the Soviet Union. We didn't predict the collapse of Yugoslavia. We didn't predict the revolution in 1979 in Iran. We didn't predict the revolution in 1906 in Iran. We didn't predict all sorts of things, where actually our ability to sort of see these things are extremely difficult. And it's natural, to be honest. I mean, political upheaval is always difficult to predict. Because very often what you need to do is to have a sound understanding of trends, processes that are going on under the surface, and often under the surface it's difficult to see. None of us really have access to this stuff. And, it's all very well and good sitting in London and other places and sort of making sort of assessments, but we're all limited. Our vision is not going to be absolutely clear, and we get partial evidence. But the fact is, if you look at, what's going on in the country, and you look at the trends, and you look at the history, and you look at the ideology, what we do know is that actually political systems often look very stable until they're not. Okay, and this is something that one of the lessons of history, which should encourage us all to be quite humble and with a degree of humility when we look at these states, is to understand that particularly with authoritarian states are inherently more unstable. We have become a little bit inured to this fact because there's a sort of fascination with China. Okay, so everyone's sort of saying, oh, the Chinese model is marvelous. Well, yes, it is at the moment. But it's also because it's doing economically very well. But politically, it may not be doing as well. And we don't know in 10 years or 20 years' time what the developments in China will be. So the perspective of any analysis always depends on, the perspective which you're looking from. So I think in Iran as well, if I was to go back to you and look at the 1970s in Iran, or look at and then sort of say what the assessments were at the time of where the country was going, yes, there would have been reservations about the way in which the Shah might have been taking the country, but very few people sort of thought that there was going to be a religious revolution. Okay, right until the last minute. Okay, and I think in the current setup, what you have to, the various things that we have to try and assess are things that are extremely difficult to assess, and that is not just economic malaise. Economic malaise, we all like it because in our modern, unfortunately, intellectual environment, we like to measure things. Okay, anyone at work, everything has to have its metrics, doesn't it? It's tedious stuff, to be honest. We all have to measure it. And if we can't measure it, it doesn't matter. But actually, there's a number of things that are very difficult to measure. Political capital, ideology, the psychology of a state. And the trouble is with a state like Iran is that the minute the security forces or the intelligence service or whatever start to fragment or fracture or begin to defect, and it will simply be that drop over the dam, that single drop, that straw that breaks the camel's back, which will be there. That's when the thing will start to fragment and start to fracture. And then everyone will be sitting here and saying, how on earth did we not predict it? Because people will say, how did we not see it coming? Well, of course we can't see it coming. These things are very difficult to assess. But I think we do need to factor that into our analysis. And I'm going to say that I think historians, in some ways, with the longer view, have a better way of really dealing with. So I don't want to be. I'm sure. You IR or whatever. I don't even know. You're a historian, aren't you? So as historians, the looking at longer-term developments, looking at the role of ideas in systems, I think we can begin to see, where things, might fragment, where that tipping point is. And the tipping point is very difficult to assess. But let me give you a couple of hints to say. So, when the morality police are going around and encouraging women in Iran to follow their culture, right? And it's amazing the number of people who would say to me, they say, well, it's part of their culture. I said, yeah, it's so much part of their culture that you need people to beat it into them. That is, there are some real idiocies in analysis. Let's be honest about it, okay? So while they're doing it, after the Massa Amini uprisings, there were morality police going around, and they looked as if they'd eaten a rather heavy meal, And I said, why are they wearing bulletproof vests? And nobody had picked up on the fact that the morality police were wearing bulletproof vests. And of course, the answer came back, well, people were shooting at them. Well, if that's the case, then I think we're in a slightly different environment. Why are officials in the Islamic Republic wearing bulletproof vests on a very frequent occurrence these days? Okay, some of them may be possible targets, I'm not saying that. But morality police? I mean, so again, it does tell us something. It does tell us that something is wrong. If you look at the way in which a series of high-level officials in Iran have been assassinated over the last 2-3 years, a great many of these can only have been targeted because there were leaks from the inside. Ismail Haniyeh would not, it is impossible that Ismail Haniyeh would have been assassinated in a government guest house during the inauguration of the new president if something somewhere on the inside hadn't leaked the information. So you've got to think, what does that tell us? And again, this is the sort of way when people say, why hasn't the state collapsed? My answer to them is, it's not looking very safe at the moment. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look very stable. And it's indicating that things are beginning to fracture. Now, when we get to the tipping point is a matter with why you pay me and Andreas to keep doing this analysis, keeps us in a business and living, but it's difficult. It's difficult to know the tipping point because we never fully have all the information that you would need to make such an assessment.
Can I add something to this? So in my business, we're doing forecasting and scenario planning. So usually trends. And for the reasons that Ali just outlined, if you look at the way that social politics, social psychology works, you realize that there's so many different data points that you'll need to account for. And it's just one of them not acting in the way you predict, and that will bring the whole network to an explosion. And so what is interesting now, what we're seeing is the data points might be 500 million data points for you, and then even then you wouldn't know when it happens. AI adds a new layer to this where we have the data points, and we're trying to use quite a lot of, so what we're doing in my business right now, we're trying to use historic analysis and then linking it up with AI to kind of trying to be more accurate in terms of the trends. But even then you're still in the realm of probabilities rather than certainty, right? You will never erase certainty, but the probability certainly doesn't look good for the regime.
It's really interesting. I'm really conscious of time, and I have to open it to your questions, so keep your questions ready. I'm going to do that in a minute, but before doing that, there's an elephant in the room, Trump and his administration. What's going to happen with that? Especially, we know Netanyahu's kind of pushing towards a war. He wants Islamic Republic gone from as a government in Iran, or at least he create that narrative, in your words. What do you think is going to happen in 2025?
Donald Trump is an immensely interesting character, isn't he? For all kinds of reasons. But, most people bash, obviously, especially here in Europe, we're like, oh, Trump, oh my God, what a loser. The thing with Donald Trump is he has no Middle East foreign and security policy. And he's also very much non-ideological in comparison to Biden. This is matters when it comes to Israel. I mean, even the fact that a lot of the ideologues in his cabinet now might be extremely pro-Israel. The people who will run the policy also have extremely close ties to the Arab Gulf. The way I see this policy unraveling now is a competition between two camps in Washington. So if you don't have a clear direction, it's up to the highest bidder to basically go and put the money in, put the lobbying in to get your sort of policy. And there are two camps. One camp is the pro-Israel camp, which is your AIPACs, which is all these different networks that Israel has mobilized extremely successfully on one end. And the other end, it's the lobbying networks of the Gulf states, most importantly Saudi, UAE, and Qatar. And they have immense leverage, and they spend tens of billions over the last couple of years in Washington to get access to exactly these people who are now in government. Both sides will lobby the Trump administration in one or the other direction. When it comes to Iran, obviously, the pro-Israel lobby is, obviously they don't like the Iranians, but they're not as harshly pro-regime change as the Gulf lobby is for regime maintenance, which is quite interesting. We've come a long way from where we were 8 years ago. So especially with Saudi Arabia, the UAE is probably the only country in the GCC right now that is taking a very strong anti-Iran position, but even they have, as I said before, have made their peace with the IRGC by allowing them to do business through their hubs and through their financial networks. But the Saudis have completely turned. I mean, if you speak to Saudis today, they don't like the Iranians, but they're extremely pragmatic. They don't want regime change. They don't want chaos. They want stability. Trump wants stability. Trump doesn't. He's been elected on a domestic agenda. He wants to continue his domestic policies without having to cater to a region that doesn't really matter to him, which is the Middle East. So he wants to delegate that. He wants to outsource this to someone. And the thing is, war with Iran, which is what Netanyahu wants, is not in the US interest. It's not in the US taxpayers' interest. It's certainly not for those America First guys. It's certainly not what they want. And the interesting bit is most of the anti-regime hawks who were in the previous government have all been fired. They've actually not only been fired, they've been penalized by the Trump administration. So what we see now is Trump, and he obviously had that meeting between the Iranians and Elon Musk. There is certainly an attempt by the Trump administration to see if a deal can be had. Everything is about a deal. And who's going to facilitate that deal is not the Israelis. It's going to be Qatar, it's going to be Oman, it might be the Saudis, because they are already the interlocutor between the US and Iran. So it's a very different sort of regional context in which Trump operates from his first term, in the way that nobody in Washington, or very few in Washington, actually want to now harshly engage that regime. They just want to pragmatically make peace with it.
Some people even suggest, Trump is capable of going behind everyone else's back and, making a deal with Iran. But the question is, would Iran do the same?
Well, it's interesting because I think there's sort of a mirror image in Iran, where you have Khamenei he sends Zarif to Davos to make lots of asinine comments, I have to say. He's obviously, putting out some fishing for seeing what the result will be. I mean, remarkably so. I mean, I find, that Zarif says things like, it wasn't Trump's fault that he came out of the JCPOA, it was Bolton's fault, and, Trump's very reliable and all sorts of things. I mean, really quite extraordinary.
Everyone knows how to.
I know, so that... but of course, Zarif is an interesting character because he's not liked by, what we would call liberals in Iran, and he's not liked by the hardliners either. So he's sort of sad. But clearly he's been given a certain carte blanche to say these things. And I think there's an element within the regime in Iran where they're trying to see, what our posture is going to be. Where I'm slightly less sanguine, I suppose, in terms of the prospects of a deal, is I think that both sides are looking for a deal that the other side can't accept. Okay, so Khamenei would be interested in a deal, but he wants a deal that allows him basically to, rearm, regroup, and get back to business in 5 years' time. Okay, basically to survive Trump. I mean, that's what he wants. He wants to survive Trump, and then we'll get back. Trump, on the other hand, would like a deal, I think, in some ways. But what's the sort of deal he wants? The sort of deal he wants is basically going to be dealing with Iran's nuclear program, Iran's missile program, Iran's regional. I mean, it's going to be a much more, because Trump, wants to see himself as this man of peace in the area. And he does have, I think the Israeli lobby will be quite tough with him. I mean, I don't think he's going to be able to get away with, substantially less, and it's got to be better than Obama achieved, right? I mean, it's got to be better than that. And of course, Khamenei, I don't think is going to accept that at all. I mean, there's absolutely no way they're going to accept it. If, the Iranians were sensible, which they're not, I'm talking about the regime, by the way, they would see this as an opportunity, actually, to do something quite drastic. But the trouble is that the revolution has not run out, as far as they're concerned, the revolution has not run out of road yet. And they simply see this as, a truce or an armistice en route to the next conflict, in a sense. And I don't think Trump can really, I don't think those round up. So, my sense is that what will happen is a period of sort of containment mixed with a certain amount of maximum pressure, as Trump likes to call it, but with a sort of a halfway house. The thing for me, and I will say this, is I don't think this has actually any significant effect on what's going on in Iran itself. I mean, I think this is a distraction, actually, for the Iranians. The Iranians, the regime itself, they've got it into their heads that all their problems are caused by sanctions and what's going on abroad. And it's a powerful narrative, but it's just not true. I mean, it's just not true. The fundamental problems affecting Iran are internal. The kleptocracy is internal. There are reasons why Iran has not been able to secure any serious foreign direct investment in the 44 or 45 years that the Islamic Republic has been in existence. Forget the sanctions, right? There are reasons why the JCPOA was not working even before Trump pulled out on it, even though it wasn't his fault, right? And the Iranians have to sort of recognize, I mean, there's no shortage of economists, by the way, in Iran, who understand the level and the complexity of the problems facing the country. I dare say that I think some of them even underestimate that problem because they don't see it as a sort of an ideological problem as well, not simply a question of changing economic policy. The reason why economic policy will not change in Iran is because ideologically they're ill-suited to it. And whenever an economist comes up, and this is the definition for me of an ideological state, whenever someone comes and opposes the ideology that underpins the state, what happens? They don't change the ideas. They don't look at the ideas in a meaningful way and try and reflect on it and change them. Instead, they either imprison, exile, or shoot the critic. Yeah, if it's not working, it's because we haven't implemented the revolution properly. Well, good luck with that. Okay? Good luck with that. And I think actually Trump is actually secondary to this problem. So the Iranians have it in their heads that all we need to do is be chummy with the Americans. I hate to say it to them, it's not going to work.
Thank you so much. I'm sure you're bubbling with questions, so you can put your hands up. And yes, there are 2 microphones going around the room, so anyone have questions, you can raise your hand. But also, I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there are. Okay, let's start with. Yes.
Great, thank you. So a lot of us in the room, I think, are either of Iranian heritage or maybe like me, half Iranian. Maybe we've been to Iran or we kind of long for an Iran that has a story attached to it that's been passed down by our family members. And I think another elephant in the room, other than Trump, is another elephant. But the other elephant is, how can we get Iran on a path to where there is democracy and freedom and an economy that functions for all levels of society and not a kleptocracy? So what might that, maybe it's a revolution, maybe it's not, what might that look like in the best case scenario, and what might it look like in the worst case scenario?
What, in terms of how we might help with that, is that what you're asking? I mean, my first advice anyway is do no harm. Okay, I mean, I think that the way in which the West sometimes has acted is it's behaved in ways that are both less strategic and less coherent than we would like, and they tend to help those that don't like them and hinder those that like them. So I think that's not the right way to do it. I'm not in favour of any sort of type of, my point about this, and I've always made very clear, I don't think the idea of interfering and, getting involved in, God help us, regime change and all this, I mean, none of this is of any use at all. I think the Iranians are quite capable of doing it themselves. But if the Iranians are doing it themselves, then they should have the right to do it themselves, is what I'm saying. I mean, my point, my criticism, I think, of many in the West has been that they have tended to argue stability at all costs, which is fine. I understand that sort of thing. But if the Iranians want to sort of change the system in which they operate in, then who are we to stop them at the end of the day? And my point about there's been numerous examples in the last 120 years, as you might imagine, where things have not gone right. And one of the interesting things that when you look at even going back 100 years to the Constitutional Revolution, there were many appeals to Britain at the time to be more proactive in terms of support of the Constitution, which originally the British were, of course. And one of the interesting claims there is they would say, and it's an interesting way to look at it, they said, we're not asking for Britain to intervene to support our revolution, we're asking for Britain to stop the Russians intervening and blocking our revolution. I mean, do you see what I mean? I mean, it was a much more interesting and subtle way of looking at it. And I think there are many things that people can do to help, the processes we would like, in some ways, the organic change that in some ways will come. I mean, you have a very secular society in Iran today. You have one that is fighting for sort of rights that have been, gestating in Iran for decades. I mean, this is not a modern thing. I mean, people are just, what I think gives me most hope is that despite 44 years of the Islamic Republic and the repression that's happened, is a lot of these ideas are still there. I mean, young people are still fighting for these. So we need to make sure that they have the information, they have the means, and they have the sort of the ways of being able to articulate their positions and in some ways to assist it. Now, you know, I happen to agree with Andreas, I have to say. I don't think this is going to be easy. Nobody should have any illusions about this fact that this is going to be some sort of like cakewalk. I mean, these things are struggles. But the benefit of it being a struggle is I think hopefully people will understand the value of what they've got eventually, right? And in that will be something that is worth protecting. And I think at the end of the day, the West needs to be aware of this. It's just know how to respond to it, you know, when, I will say when, by the way, because I think it will happen. Okay, but when it happens, don't ignore it. You know, respond to it in a constructive manner, and things are, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let me put it that way as well. So I mean, I think there are means and ways, but I think fundamentally it's got to be an internal process. Okay, you start interfering in things like that, the track record is not good, so avoid it. Okay.
I'm going to respond to you as well from the grassroots point of view. So I've been spending, for the ones who don't know, I've been spending the last 2 years working with activists inside the country and as well as diaspora, and trying to map out what's happening and creating a civil society. And I think in response to your questions, you know, on top of what Ali said, it's us who's going to create that change. And there is that willingness within the Iranian community that didn't exist before Women Life Freedom. Women Life Freedom, because of its values, you know, it's about human rights, because if you observe the rights of women, you're observing the rights of all of the different groups in your society. It's about environmental issues. It's about liberty values. So these values are quite core to what different groups of dissent were asking about during different protests inside Iran. And it brought even the Iranians who didn't pay attention to the politics, or in diaspora who didn't even care about Iran or even identify as Iranians anymore, back to Iran, look like, you know, we were all on a ship and looking in different directions and thinking everyone else is on this shore and having their pina colada and enjoying the, you know, their sunny beaches. But then suddenly Women Life Freedom reminded everyone that we are still on the same boat and heading to the same direction. And because of that, for the last 2 years, we're seeing a lot of different groups organizing themselves, starting to having conversations, and as well as, you know, trying to find out who would be able to align with them. That's why we've seen Georgetown, you know, panel. There was an effort. It failed. But that's the process in democracy, right? We need to try as much as possible, and we teach organizing, and we use this term, you have to ride a bike to learn how to ride it. You cannot read a book and watch a TV about your TikTok videos nowadays. So I see that effort within the Iranian community, and that makes me hopeful. But that's my job as an activist, to be hopeful as well. So,
thank you. I'm Elizabeth Humphrey. I'm a PhD candidate at LSE studying IR, but very sympathetic to the historical IR cause. Yeah, I'm wondering, I guess I would have I'm curious about, I have 2 questions, but if that's allowed. But basically with this network state idea, I have kind of an academic question and a more social activist question, but from this academic side, I'm a little wondering what utility it offers, because to me, the idea of a network state, well, first of all, you talk about sort of the network as being apart from the state somehow and self-sustaining. So I was wondering if you could sort of explain that a little bit more. But also, what's new about now in Iran or in other states, for that matter, that sort of makes it networked? Weren't states always kind of networked in a way? I mean, in different ways. I mean, I study Central Asia, and it's the classic sort of, you know, extension. And then my second question, I just wanted to ask, what do you see as the role of the international Iranian community specifically? Maybe, should I get, yeah.
Well, the utility of network theory, I don't want to get into this, it's extremely academic, but I think we have one major flaw in our entire IR theory, and I think rather than being a historian than an IR theory, and again, very problematic statement to start even the problem with IR theory. The problem with IR theory is that it is not just very state-centric, but it relies on hierarchy. The way we teach strategy, and I've been teaching strategy for our civil service in the military here for 15 years, and it is extremely based on hierarchies. It's linear, and sequential, the way we look at things. Networks don't act in a linear way, they don't act in a sequential way, and they're not based on hierarchies but on heterarchies, right? They're not vertical but they're horizontal. There's a fundamentally different understanding of how these organizations work. If you still think about states today, and this is true for everything, and I started many, many years ago looking at state, non-state actor relations and assemblages, and that happens in every state. I mean, it happens here as well. We are exporting to the market. We're outsourcing to the market, and you see that there are all kinds of non-state actors working with this state here in the UK, despite the fact it's very hierarchical, to deliver a public good. What we see with network states such as Iran is that the attempt of building a hierarchy was never really made. I mean, yes, there is one on the facade, but underlying its personal networks. That's true for the Gulf states as well, right? They all kind of, because the way that the colonialist went about is we told the world, we in the West told the world, the way that we built statehood since, the 1800s or 1700s, the way we build our states as hierarchies, this is the best way of how we build governance. This is the best way, most efficient way to organize governance. And most states have emulated that. Most states have implemented that. That doesn't mean, however, that these states actually have a functioning hierarchy. So if you look at the Gulf states, they all have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and they have a Ministry of Defense and so on. It's all very hierarchical. They've got a ranking system. But it's what actually shapes statecraft in the background and governance, both of it, happens in the background through networks. That's something we need to understand. Also, if you look at China, the same thing applies. You look at Russia. Russia is a quintessential network state. There is a core, and all the other actors revolve around that core. The problem that most analysts have is they look at it and look, oh, this is a dictatorship. They must be extremely hierarchical, top-heavy. Putin is a primus inter pares, a very powerful one. Same as for Xi Jinping. He's a powerful primus inter pares, but inter pares, which means there are a lot of other nodes around who are equally powerful. And the same is true for Iran. Yes, the supreme leader is supreme in many ways, but he has a lot of other power nodes around him that he needs to account for. And I think when we talk about regime change, there are some inflection points coming. When the supreme leader dies, that core will be renegotiated. That relationship between the core and the periphery will be renegotiated. That's an inflection point where God knows, nobody knows what's going to happen, and whether this will lead to a massive explosion or further gradual degradation, we don't know that. But why I'm saying networks is so important is we fundamentally need to question all the assumptions that we have made since the 18th century, thinking that's how the world works, when in reality most of history never worked through hierarchies, it always worked through networks.
For your question about the Iranian diaspora, I'm going to say something that wouldn't be popular amongst the Iranians, but I'm happy to. Anyways, I think the problem with the Iranian diaspora is that there's a majority of the Iranian diaspora who left Iran for different reasons during different times, and a portion of them have loyalty towards the former Shah of Iran, and they're the ones mostly who have the money. So the financial part of any revolution or any change is in the hand of the monarchist. Then you have these groups of people who took to the streets during the 1979 revolution, who genuinely are not siding with the monarchists and been active politically, even in diaspora, for the last 4 decades. Then you have the younger generation who's disillusioned with the Iranian political scene in general, and they don't trust the former political activists and parties. And then you have the technology, people who are residing in Silicon Valley and have a lot of influence in certain governments as well as certain communities, both inside and outside Iran, who don't know where they're standing at the moment. So they're leaning either towards the monarchists or either towards the younger generation. And in mishmash of all of this, there is like this effort, no one is actually taking the lead, there is not enough leaders who can bring all of these different fractions together to be able to trust each other, first of all, and then build on that trust to make them work together. And I think that has been the fundamental problem within Iran as well as outside Iran. But there's a justification for people inside Iran. You know, the government has been, you know, beating on the drum of otherness for years and years. They actively going against any community building inside the country and network building inside the country and crash anything that emerges. But outside, we don't have that problem. But I've been talking to some of the you know, activists from Kurdish political parties to other, you know, non-monarchist parties, and they laid out a lot of plans. They you know, they had a lot of meetings, writing proposals, coming up with plans of the future, but none of them actually been fruitful. So I asked them, why do you think, what was your fault? What part of the responsibility is, you know, lying on your shoulder? And there is this thing, my solution, okay, I'm gonna move forward. I'm not gonna say it on the record because I completely forgot that it's being live, but so my solution for it, or my suggestion for it, is that all of these groups, anyone who's older than 50, look at themselves and think, am I gonna go back to Iran and put my life into creating a change? Or am I in this just to gain power? And if the answer to that question is gaining power, become an advisor. Set aside, you know, stand aside and support the younger Iranian leaders who we can train and, you know, put forward in the next 10 years. Because what Iran needs at the moment is the expertise of the people, you know, lesson learned from the failures, mostly failures and some successes, and be able to create new leaders who can take us for the, you know, towards the future. And that future is not going to come overnight. Yes, there might be a revolution or there might be a collapse of the government tomorrow morning, but that's not democracy. Democracy needs time. It needs intentional efforts on a daily basis to be able to be fruitful. And I think, yeah, and I think there is an understanding within the diaspora now more than ever that this is the way to go, and hopefully in the next 10 years, we will see that happening.
I was wondering, is there still quite a stark divide between people who live in urban centers and people who live in rural areas? I know that in the past it was, because we often look at, you know, activism and we talk about secular people, et cetera, but it is in the big urban centers, and it tends to be maybe more conservative the further you move away. So I was just wondering whether that divide had become more narrow today, and whether, yeah, what you thought of it.
So, I mean, Iran is largely urban now. I mean, ever since the revolution, the population, the demographics are that Iran, I don't know what the percentages are, but it's overwhelmingly urban, actually, rather than rural. So, in terms of that divide, I think the divide is much narrower than people think. I did a lot of work on the 2009 election, as people may be aware. Got me into a lot of trouble, but anyway. And if you look at the breakdown and the figures and stuff, I mean, there was no rural-urban divide in the sense that people thought there was. There was some distinction between parts of the city, for instance, in terms of South Tehran and, say, North Tehran and this sort of thing. But even that now, to be honest, and maybe Negin can maybe sort of come in on this, she would probably know better than me, but I mean, I get the sense that actually the distinction is more of a generational one than really a demographic in terms of rural-urban, I mean. So I think that distinction is not there. And also you have to bear in mind, as I remind people, when Khatami was elected in 1997 on an overtly reformist platform, I mean, he did win a landslide which covered most of the country, actually. And that election was probably the fairest that the Islamic Republic has seen, right? These things are all relative, but the fact is it doesn't compare with what Ahmadinejad did in 2005 and 2009. So, I mean, I think these distinctions are less valid than they used to be, certainly if you were to look at a 1979 figure or the pre-revolutionary period. I think there's much more of a generational problem, and that, you know, certainly if you look at the number of people not wearing the veil anymore in Iran, among women, obviously, I mean, people are saying it's approaching 30 to 40%. Now, if you say 30 to 40%, your natural instinct is to say, oh, is that North Tehran? Which is that. But actually, and certainly anecdotal and other evidence that you're sort of gathering, it's much, much more widespread, and it's even getting into central areas and sort of parts of cities and other areas that would, you know, traditionally be seen as, for the sake of argument, more working class or lower middle class, which you might think are more inherently conservative with a small c, okay? But it's just not the case. I mean, there's a sea change in attitudes going on. So I think we have to be quite careful in that, and making the, you know, which is a usual argument. I hear it endlessly from pundits, and I use pundits in a derogatory term, by the way, you know, who say, oh yes, but this is just North Tehran and it has nothing to do with the rest of the country. That's not true. It's not true. How they reach that conclusion when they haven't been to the country, I don't know. But they, you know, it's a good way of getting out of actually doing anything or acknowledging that any change has happened. Clearly change happens, and clearly that has happened. I mean, there is a process by which, and one of the most interesting things I have to say, even during the Mahsa Amini protests, it was apparent to people looking at it in more detail that, and you see this actually in Rasulov's new film, actually, and he does it very well, where actually, the division is between, you know, you have the regime official, a judge in the case of the film, but I mean, during the protests, there were a lot of IRGC officials who were becoming very stressed by the fact that the people demonstrating on the streets were their children. You know, this again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The fractures here are significant, and they are likely to widen.
I see questions, so I'm not going to respond to that. Yes, Steve, sorry. Hold on a sec to give you the mic, and then there's another question there. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for a very interesting panel. My question, I suppose, is again coming back a little bit to the pessimism, optimism things. I'm interested in your thoughts. You guys talked a couple of times about the tipping point idea, which I think there's almost a consensus there that things are coming, and there's the echoes there of the famous account by Ryszard Kapuscinski, the Polish author, who talked about the zigzag to the precipice. So at a certain point, hard sometimes to see in the moment, but afterwards you can see that was the tipping point. I know Iran very little. I've been there just once, but was struck while there by, again, what you described, the huge gap between regime thinking and ordinary popular sense, which you don't get from the newspapers, really. And from my travels, could only be compared to the country of Poland, where Kapuscinski is from. Charles is widely seen in Poland. Was widely seen, oh, I see, yes, indeed. Was widely seen in Poland as a kind of metaphor, in a sense, for what was happening in Poland. And Poland was unlike, so the Soviet Union, you'd find quite a lot of people who were kind of loyal or didn't want to hold things against. In East Germany, the same thing, even in communist Czechoslovakia. But Poland always had that sense of, we don't want it to be here. And as somebody who didn't know the country before, that leapt out from, not just from conversations, but also body language in many, many, many encounters. So my question there is the end in Poland. Eventually, you talked about it not being predictable. I have to say I would push back on that a bit, because if you're looking at civil society, actually it was only one way, and it was the politicians who utterly failed because they only wanted to look at their opposite numbers. The civil society was unbelievably strong. And what happened there, in effect, drove down later the fall of the Berlin Wall. All of that happened super peacefully in Poland, not across Eastern Europe, but in Poland specifically, and in East Germany. So my question to you is, you talked about all of the reasons, you didn't use the phrase, but if you like, the cornered rats in the cage could be very, very bloody. We could also have, perhaps, this is a question to you, in Syria, that collapse, which was kind of semi-military, was much more everyone just saying, actually, we want no part of this, and it happened very quickly. Or even, could that strength of civil society produce a kind of peaceful handover? Is that just the dreamer's version, or is that possible somewhere, do you think? And if I may tag on one bit to the end of that, again, from my own personal experience, Jaruzelski, who in Poland, General Jaruzelski, had put tanks on the streets in 1981. In 89, he did the handover. And years later, I asked him, what would have happened if you hadn't done the peaceful handover? You know, you'd still got all the tanks and the troops. And he said, believe me, the result, loss of power by the ruling Communist Party, would be just the same but more bloody. So what are the kind of contrasts and what are the similarities you think you would see there? Thanks.
I think there are a range of options. I mean, I agree with you in terms of, by the way, the sort of, it was said that historians prophesy, they don't predict. And again, I would tend to agree with you that there would have been some people who could have seen, obviously, that certain things were moving in a certain direction, but it's the politicians and the analysts who don't. Partly because, you know, by the way, you know, prophesying or predicting change is hard work. I mean, and it's not... It's much better to have the status quo. We can keep releasing the same reports over and over again, you know. So it's, the change is something that is quite problematic in that sense. So, I mean, you know, obviously all sorts of transitions have taken place. There are a myriad ways in which Iran could go. I tend to sort of agree, actually, in some ways with Andreas here, that I think the road in Iran is not an easy one, okay? And there will be people there who will resist. I mean, who will resist the change that will come in. That said, at the same time, one must sort of think that, you know, there are opportunities for other outcomes. I can't see, obviously, the Eastern European outcome is a fairly particular one, because you have a Gorbachev figure, of course, who also refused to, you know, at the end of that. I mean, you could say, you know, who basically was prepared not to send in the tanks in some ways. I mean, so I mean, in Iran. Again, my issue really is not so much of the state getting prepared to send in the tanks. It's actually that the state begins to fracture, okay, so that you don't have the sort of central authority. Now, again, I want to be very clear here, and so my definitions are clear. I'm not talking about the country here, by the way. I'm not talking about the political culture. I'm not talking about the country or wider society. I'm talking about the political system being unable to function. And if the political system starts not being able to deliver, there are certain consequences of that. One of these, as Andreas says, is that local networks will take on more of a role. And we saw that in the early part of the last century, for instance, where central government began to break down. It never necessarily went away, but it couldn't really do much. And so local networks and others took over. Some were better, some were worse. I mean, you know, there was things like that. But in terms of a central government, things didn't begin to function. The problem in Iran today is that these little networks, by the way, I mean, in Iran they call them mafias, okay? I mean, they say we are governed by a network of mafias. And it's amazing the number of mafias that people think there are. You know, I would say, well, there are 8. They say, no, there are hundreds. You know, and I, oh my God, you know, I mean, if it's 100, it's going to be a complete catastrophe, you know. All fighting for basically resources. A lot of ordinary people, of course, will have nothing to do with this. I mean, this is a sort of almost an elite punch-up. But it does mean that I think in some ways it will be messier than people think, yeah? And you know, we, again, from looking from the outside in, we need to be prepared for that. As do Iranians, I think, need to be sober about what this process means. The problem I find with people is I sort of look at the way in which the regime is functioning and the way it's conducting itself, unless it makes radical changes, you can see, as you were saying, like, well, where the direction of travel is going. I mean, it is going to get to a stage where it cannot deliver the basic sort of, on the most fundamental elements of the social contract to its own people. And once that happens, you know, this sort of thing is going to break down. So, I mean, I don't want to go into detail about various options. I could at some stage. Yeah, and I'm conscious of time. So I won't go into detail about it. But, you know, there are various options. It's not really for me, I suppose, to sort of like predict or prophesy or whatever. But, you know, there are a range of possible outcomes. And some nicer and some less nice. But, I mean, the fact is that one thing I'm fairly certain about is that the state is getting weaker.
One quick, I mean, I've been looking at, particularly the Arab Spring and how change came about there in the Arab world, where, you know, you had so many different revolutions and counter-revolutions. And if you look at Syria, I mean, the regime very much has been in a state of falling for at least 12 years before it collapsed at the end of last year. And so people thought, oh, this was a sudden sort of regime change. It wasn't. I mean, it was just the Russians and the Iranians basically pulling out, and then the whole house of cards collapsed. But there is something about spontaneous order. I don't know if you've ever heard about this idea of the market. It's very much an LSE sort of a market-oriented, a macroeconomic term. The idea that the market is basically, the stability in the market is a spontaneous order that comes about through micro-processes that bring about an equilibrium that is constantly being renegotiated. These kind of micro processes, there are billions of them. It's every individual, every market actor, every stakeholder. The same is true in Iran. There's so many stakeholders in this. And predicting, and that's the whole problem with predicting when a regime is going to fall, is there's so many micro processes you have to account for. And when do you know when this new spontaneous order is collapsing? Because the opposite of order is not necessarily chaos. I mean, there isn't, there's always going to be some sort of order. You might not like it. The same way that there aren't any ungoverned spaces. People call about ungoverned spaces. They are not ungoverned. They're ill-governed, right? But governance never breaks down. Like in northern Syria, the regime left, but then locally, villages started to organize themselves. So I do think, I mean, Syria was I used to live in Syria, went to university there. And the thing with Syria, when I lived there in 2006, nearly 20 years ago, I thought this regime is no way this will ever collapse because it was so robust. And when 2010-11 happened, I thought the last one of all of these is the Syrian one to collapse. It eventually did collapse, but what a struggle it was to get it to the point where Bashar actually finally left. So I think Iran in many ways could be the same way, where you have different elites constantly pulling back, where the regime at the core will survive, but on the fringes it's already collapsed. And it's in a process of free fall, but it doesn't mean it's fallen yet.
Sorry, it took so long.
Can I just say
really quickly?
Really quick. But do you think that the Syrian situation was prolonged precisely because the Russians and the Iranians supported it?
Oh yeah, because they're the intervening variable. Again, going back to spontaneous order, there are so many intervening variables.
So I mean, the interesting thing is who would support Iran?
Who's the Islamic Republic?
Yeah.
The Chinese, the Russians. I mean, we haven't even talked about great power competition right now.
I should have asked this question at the beginning. Yes. Yes.
So I wanted to understand the same thing. Like we've talked about, you said Saudi Arabia has kind of made peace with Iran to survive, to exist. But what we haven't talked about is one, Turkey. And the third one that we haven't talked about is Russia, essentially. So how much of an influence do these actors play into the state of Iran or existing of the current regime of Iran? And a minor question, if we still have time after that, would be with regards to the factor of religion. Like this is probably the one major Shia surrounded by Sunnis around, essentially. So I know it's more of a secular place, but still when you are in a survival mode, the way probably it is portrayed in Israel as well, essentially, how could there be a possibility of radicalization of society there too at the end of the day in terms of what?
Okay, lovely. 2 minutes, whoever can wrap
I'm not going to talk about religion, but just on, I'll leave that to you. But the thing is, looking at great power competition, Russia is an important factor in this, China is an important factor. They have an interest in, because the anti-Iran sort of agenda, the anti-Islamic Republic agenda is run by Western countries, right? And so, whether you go to the UK, the US, Europe, everyone's like, oh, Iran, problematizing Iran. So for Russia and China, there's a great opportunity in the global war of narratives to say, actually, we like to support the Iranians, and we're trying to give them a helping hand. But this only goes that far. What's quite interesting is there's been an agenda within BRICS that the Iranians have been trying to seek support from is de-dollarization, the idea of that, the Chinese and the Russians, they will help de-dollarize the trade. Now, Trump has made it very clear, if you do that, there will be 100% tariffs and sanctions. And so BRICS already stepped back from that idea, saying, oh no, we're not going to support this to Russia. Even the Russians said, we don't want to support this, despite everything. But the thing is, the Iran project has become part of that great power competition project as well, where people will try to keep it alive because there's the fear that regime change, particularly in Russia, massive fear that regime change will lead to a pro-Western government, and that's something they want to avoid at all costs.
Just to be very clear, so I don't think the Chinese will actually come to save an Islamic Republic. I think the Russians are the ones but you see, my point is that the Russians are too preoccupied with their own war. So it depends. I mean, if the Russians come out with a deal on Ukraine and whatever and can, reorganize and regroup, I think they absolutely do have an interest in maintaining the Islamic Republic and revolution as it is, because they're sort of soulmates. I mean, I've always said to people now, if you want to really understand Iranian ideology, just listen to Medvedev. I mean, he's into apocalyptic visions all the world over. It's really quite bizarre. So they would, and I do agree with that. I think and they've done it in the past. But I just don't think the Russians are actually in a position at the moment to do much. And the Russian-Iranian relationship is an interesting one, I have to say, because they're both allies, but they also don't like each other. And you saw that really in the criticism of when the Israelis did the attacks on Iran. You know, the Iranians were criticizing the fact that the Russians basically turned off the radar in Syria to make sure the Israeli planes could get over. So there's something there that it's a relationship, not made in heaven, let's put it that way. So I don't know really what's going on there. But I think, at the moment, the international environment has never been so unfriendly to Iran. I think there's a lot of people who are willing to maintain a sort of status quo, but nobody really loves the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, that's the problem. Nobody's really sort of is close to them. So, they're finding themselves with very, very few friends. But yes, I think I'm looking forward to AI and it's coming out and sorting out all these variables and seeing what the hell it will predict. That would be quite good fun. And I've heard that it's got the capacity to sort of really weed these things out. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what that comes out with. But yes, at the moment, I think, to paraphrase the Chinese again, we live in interesting times.
Lovely. And I think we don't have enough time to do a wrap up. So, but the guests will be around for a couple of minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes. So if you have any burning questions, you can ask them later on. And thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the Conduit to creating this space for us. Thank you.